Well, let's get to our first discussion for today. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, by the provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act, would on July 19, that's tomorrow, this year, fully transition to become a full limited liability company. With the passing into law of the Reformed Companies and Allied Matters Act, CAMA 2020, which replaced the CAMA 1990 Act, companies like the NNPC are now provided with a regulatory framework for how businesses should be carried out in the country, which includes the framework on areas of shareholding registration processes, statements of compliance, minimum share capital, audit obligations, amongst others. It will interest you to know that with this move, the NNPC, like every other commercial company operating in the country, will pay taxes to government and eventually be able to pay dividends to its shareholders. Represented by government in its teething stages, and then the public when it decides to have an initial public offer, as well as pay taxes to the government. To give us more insights and prospects to these challenges and, of course, the positives of this development, I'm being joined virtually by a partner, commercial and energy law practice, CANDELP, Mr. Israel Aye. Thank you so much for your time. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, let's start very quickly. It seems to be interesting. The NNPC that we used to know is transforming to a company, limited liability company. First, what does this really mean with regards to the CAMA Act of 2020 in straight terms? What are the changes that we would see?
Well, ideally, and by the way, the Petroleum Industry Act, as it now is, actually retains the NNPC Corporation even as a transitional entity. So, in effect, the NNPC, as it was established by the Act of 1977, is supposed to continue to be in existence, almost like an AMCON of that particular institution. It is supposed to retain what is referred to as toxic assets in order for the limited liability company, which is a purely commercial entity, to be able to take off. Now, to your question, what is this supposed to portend? This is then supposed to be a step change from effectively a corporation under Nigerian law, which is an entity set up by an act of parliament, so to say, and a corporate affairs and commission, or CAMA, what we call it CAMA, the Corporate Affairs Act, registered entity. This is supposed to be subject to the governance requirements of that particular law, some of which you have already reeled out in terms of reporting, filing, audits, and the likes of it. In practical terms, this is supposed to result in more transparency and more accountability in terms of how it operates. So that, in effect, is what it should be.
Now, the operations of NNPC, of course, one way or the other, in accordance to the PIA, will now make it profit-oriented, kind of. Two questions here. When you say profit-oriented in this same market, I hope we won't have issues like, you know what happened between the Seplat and ExxonMobil thing. Some say that this could send wrong signals. I hope that we won't be having issues like this moving on in the sector, talking about joint ventures and all of that.
Well, I mean, it's a shame, and I was trying not to say so, that we're having this type of conversation at all. Remember that part of what drove the restructuring of the industry and led to the Petroleum Industry Act is to introduce better governance. And we say that the global best practice in terms of governance is to separate policy from regulations, from commercial activity. Now, the old NNPC, perhaps due to no fault of it, was functioning in all space. I remember that Section 10 of the old NNPC Act, as a matter of fact, established the inspectorate, which you would argue metamorphosed in some shape or form into the old Department of Petroleum Resources. So part of its DNA indeed is steeped in regulation. Again, because the successive ministers have not had proper back offices, the NNPC, quite frankly, just then turns up because it has institutional memory, becomes the back office to the minister in terms of policy, which, by the way, some communication from NNPC itself suggests has been retained, i.e. NNPC continues to act as the minister's back office for policy's sake. But we understand that global best practice does not really encourage that. So indeed, one of the reasons why you created a private company, and we need to make that argument, is in order for it to focus exclusively on commercial activities, how be it on behalf of the government, yes, and to concentrate on commercial activities in a manner that is profit-oriented. That in and of itself should not be a problem. I mean, we have the very good example of the NLNG, which is an incorporated joint venture comprising the present NNPC and a couple of other IOCs, and that has run creditably in as far as we're concerned. Very good governance, very good management, and making healthy returns, and has bailed out this country at times of dire need. So indeed, we have an example in our system that works, and hopefully we will be able to get it right in terms of how we set up the governance and management.
One thing that I think would also concern Nigerians, and I would like to ask you, is that in that race to be profitable and all of it, would this not affect or increase the price of products one way or the other, which would come back to the people, particularly Nigerians?
Well, I mean, when you talk about, should I respond to that? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So you see, when you talk about the link to product and the likes of it, again, it's probably a stretch because indeed, what is going to eventually drive the price at which product is obtained at the pump price or wherever else it is consumed is going to be driven more by policy, okay? And that is going to be, policy is driven more by the Minister of Petroleum Affairs, and NNPC effectively is just a player. But you know, if you're talking about NNPC, what you should really be looking at is, and you should be comparing it to, is Saudi Aramco, just as an example, you know, and those are the things you should be focusing on, i.e., how well set up is it in terms of governance? How well set up is, so for example, there's a lot of fanfare now about the unveiling, but you know, some of us are wondering, why do you effectively have one individual? And this is no slight or commentary as to his capacity or integrity as a manager, but why do we still have one person in charge of NNPC Corporation and NNPC Limited? You know, I think it's about time, and I hope that we would be very quick in separating those offices in order for the person that is coming on board as the CEO of NNPC Limited will be able to focus on the NNPC Limited type functions. Okay? So those are the things to look at. There are a few other issues around governance and management that I'm hoping we can get right in order for this not to be a case of moving one step forward and how many more steps backward.
I would also follow up. Monthly remittances of the NNPC to FAC would also stop. What will happen henceforth is that they will pay dividends at intervals defined by the approved dividend policy. Now, with an economy that struggles already at the moment with revenue issues, what impact do you think this would have on the economy?
Well, again, in terms of that, I'm not sure that NNPC can unilaterally make a decision to discontinue monthly remittances just because it has been flagged off. You know, remember that there's a transition committee in place. The results of the transition committee work has not been published. And my sense of it, and as a matter of fact, some of the noises we have heard is that because of these exigencies we have referred to, that this government will effectively pause the transitional issues, or perhaps continue in transition mode until perhaps the next government, whenever that is. So the jury is out on that, Tolu. That's what I'd say. I'm not sure that that the event of tomorrow would inevitably mean that monthly remittances are frozen, because remember that in this respect, NNPC, whichever one it is managing those resources on behalf of the federation. So it is the federation's own resources, and the federation will determine the frequency in which it receives those income.
Mr. A, I'm interested in gas because I think that is the new oil, and that is where we should be shifting focus with our proven and unproven reserves in this part of the world. Now, the new NNPC is saying that yes, the focus will be on gas to explore gas opportunities and potentials that we have. What positives do you see in that? Do you see that as a way to break back or to get more money, let me just say it the way that everyone will understand, into the sector?
Well, I mean, the entire energy transition, if you will, agenda,
Yes,
is a little in flux right now, if you think about it. I mean, with some of the more vocal advocates of it resorting to firing up their coal plants and all of that, some of the restrictions on funding of oil we see are now being lifted. And, you know, and this was always the view that some people had, and notably the late OPEC SecGen, to say, look, the energy transition is going to happen. It should not be contrived or forced. And, you know, it should not also be stifled of the resources it needs in order to properly transit. And then alongside energy transitions, also there were conversations around energy security and energy wealth in terms of African countries, or perhaps countries like Africa that produce oil. Now, that said, there is also a general understanding or agreement that gas is that sort of transition fuel. And thankfully, we have abundant gas reserves. But again, you see whether you can harness these reserves for national development, for creating wealth, for bringing people out of poverty, for creating employment for young persons, is a function of policy. You know, and there are a lot of policy inputs that have been proposed already in terms of developing a gas-based industry. NNPC by itself would make an input, but quite frankly, you know, we should stop talking as if NNPC is going to be responsible for drafting those policies and driving them. No. Those policies are supposed to be driven, to be drafted and driven from the office of the minister, and policy advocates such as yourselves and us and all Nigerian citizens should indeed demand very actively a plan, a very clear and understandable plan. It should not be couched in any euphemisms or anything that people can't understand, in order for us to be able to see and hopefully provide some sort of support to going forward.
So let's wrap up on this note. The downstream of Nigeria's oil and gas industry, what sort of intervention do you think is also needed in that space? Maybe also around the modular refineries. Let's wrap up on that note, Mr. Israel.
Well, I mean, so downstream essentially is like, I'm not sure if the word is the barrel of the gun, but that's, you know, you talk about the streams. The upstream is really where you produce the raw materials. The midstream is where you process the raw materials into some form of consumable product, and downstream is how you market it. Incidentally, there's a lot of potential downstream of the petroleum industry for taking products to the market, but the constraint that the downstream has had is an inactive or not a well-developed midstream. You know, the reason being that historically we have produced hydrocarbon to the international market, to the export market. That's really the problem. You know, the basis exists in the Petroleum Industry Act to be able to birth a vibrant midstream. But again, I guess one of the points that has come out of this particular conversation, if you think about it, is the need to get ahead of policy formulation, perhaps think through how we can get a very solid back office for the minister, this and anyone that is coming, and ensure that there's policy continuity and that we're able to get ahead of the game globally, and then be able to optimize, both maximize benefits, optimize the industry and maximize the benefit to the Nigerian people. And really, accountability in terms of resource management is the key issue. Once that happens, I believe that the current players in the downstream, would be able to step up and play their part.
I must thank you so much. I've been speaking to a partner, commercial and energy law practice, that's Mr. Israel Aye. Thank you so much for your time, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy your week too.
Thank you very much. Have a great week.